right, Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Shabbat Shalom. We thank you all for joining us again on this Shabbat for another wonderful time experiencing everybody virtually on Yah's most holy day of the week. We're going to continue our lesson in salvation, understanding who salvation is for, and this is part 6. Again, sponsored by the House of Shiloh Ministries and presented by yours truly, Brother Andrew Bradley. In part 5, we talked about defining ethnos, one of the main word used to translate to Gentile in the New Testament, the Greek word ethnos. And we're going to continue in Paul's writing on the next slide so we can to continue our understanding and defining how it truly was used. Okay? So let's go to 1 Corinthians 12 and 2 now. And here goes Paul. He starts off right off saying, "Ye know that ye were Gentiles, carried away into these dumb idols, even as ye were led." Now, we're not taught in the church to look at the small things, pay attention to the small things. Why would Paul say were? Were is the past tense. All right? So he's saying you're carried away to dumb idols. You were Gentiles. So if Gentiles meant those who are not Israel, non-Jews, as the English definition will tell you, then how am I no longer that? Did Paul somewhere say here without us knowing that they converted to Judaism? I don't think so. If Gentile was anyone who was not a Hebrew, then how can Paul say you were? Can I unbecome what I am? That's the point I'm trying to make. Can I go from a black person to a white person? Now, there is some help with science. We know that. Look at Sammy Sosa, for example. I always use him for that example. But that's not true. Genetically, we can't be something different. So the meaning here, this verse here, just really disproves the fundamental definition of Gentile. So the meaning here is not in reference to a definition of all people, but a condition Paul is stating. Because now they received the Messiah, they are no longer Gentiles. And now what the problem is with this definition also is that the church will say, see, they no longer a Gentile because they received the Messiah. But because you don't know what Gentile really means, that's something they will go to. But we've defined in part 5 and the previous part that Gentile really means ethnicity, race, clan, and so on. And ethnos, the actual Greek word, is nation, tribe, ethnicity. But Paul made sure you understood that the situation these Gentiles in is changeable. So this is not to all people. Paul is speaking to a condition in this verse. All right? Anybody want to add to this one?
Not so far.
Okay. All right, let's move to the next one. Acts 13:47. This is other writings now. We're no longer dealing strictly with Paul now. We're just going to talk about other writings. I do bounce around a little bit, but I'm going to get to the point. Acts 13:47. For so hath Adonai commanded us, or Lord commanded us, saying, I have set thee to be a light of the Gentiles, that thou shouldest be for salvation unto the ends of the earth. This is speaking to Paul's ministry. All right, that he was commanded that he would be a light to the Gentiles. So again, how should Gentile be translated? This will get cleared up if we look at the definition of earth. Now, we did look at the definition of world earlier, which people try to say world and earth are pretty much the same, and it was chronos. But here, the word in Greek is ged, and it literally means a country, land enclosed with fixed borders, a tract of land, territory, region, as that of the Hebrews. So if he says that he's going to be a light of the Gentiles, and Gentiles supposed to mean anybody that's not Jew, why would the word earth, which is purposely typically mistranslated, which is really gay, means specific land. That's what that word should say, for salvation to the end of Israel, or the end of a particular landmass.
Mm-hmm.
And it's specific to Hebrew, since Paul speaks Hebrew, and the author of Acts is Luke, who was a Hebrew. We know he's most likely, in all likelihood, is speaking of the land of Israel, because the word gay does speak to a specific land.
Mm-hmm.
And we can confirm this by looking in Romans. Romans 9:28, for he will finish the work and cut it short in righteousness, because a short work will Adonai make upon the earth. And why does this confirm the definition? Because Paul states the audience in one of the best verses I think he's ever written, Romans 9:3-5. For I could wish that myself were accursed for Mashiach, for my brethren, my kinsmen, according to the flesh,
Mm-hmm.
who are Israelites, to whom pertaineth the adoption.
Mm-hmm.
Now we already talked in part 5 of the permanent nature of the covenant, right, of the inheritance, and Paul's speaking to it right here. To whom pertaineth the adoption and the glory and the covenant and the giving of Torah and the service of Elohim and the promise, whose are the fathers, as in possessive, not plural, and of whom, as concerning the flesh, Mashiach came.
Look at that.
Who is over all, Elohim, blessed forever. Amen. So earth in 9:28 meant Israel. And what's even more significant about these verses is Paul said all of that about Israel, and then he got enough nerves to say, of whom, as concerning the flesh, the Messiah came. I thought the Messiah came for the Gentiles. Do you all see this?
Yes. Yes.
This is never taught in the church. Never has this ever been brought out to me in my faith in Christianity. Never. And this is serious, because Paul is speaking of the earth, or a particular land of people, later on in Romans, after he just speaks on in detail of who Israel is and why the Messiah came. He came for them, for us. So earth here is specifically speaking to a group of people in a particular region of the land. Thus, it debunks the definition that the translators use this word for. This is not other nation. This is to be a light of the nation. And by the way, look at that again. Let's read that again. I have set thee to be a light of. He comes of the Gentiles. He didn't say light for the nations or for the Gentiles. You could have said that.
Or to the Gentiles.
Why would they say of? Because he was of the nation, just like they were. So this shows a purposeful mistranslation for inclusiveness. This is a lie put in the scriptures by men that should not do so, which is a danger to them. They will be judged for stuff like this. I know that sounds harsh, but this is purpose. This is with purpose. Anybody want to add anything to this?
I'd just like to highlight Romans 9:3-5. There's a part there where it says, he says, he himself wished he were accursed from Mashiach for my brethren. I want to pause right there, because a lot of times we think, well, we need to do this for the brethren. And everybody in Christianity, everybody is the brethren. Anyone that says they believe in Mashiach is the brethren. But Paul is making a distinction here. He says, who are my brethren? My brethren are my kinsmen, he says. And who are your kinsmen? Flesh and blood. Those. These are the ones I'm talking about. He says, I'm not talking about the whole world. I'm not talking about every human being under the sun. I'm talking about my own flesh and blood. I'm speaking to my family. That's who I'm talking to, my brethren. My brethren. So we've been taught.
See, that's
Go ahead.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
So yeah, we've been
I
taught
was
that
just going to
brethren.
speak to the ambiguity of things. That's
Yes.
what Christianity speaks.
Mm-hmm.
But you're right. I have proof of the definition of this of brethren in my lesson as we move forward, so you can understand that they're talking of kinsmanship, of national ancestor. You're sharing a national ancestor. The actual definition in Thayer's is this. Just to prove to you, I've looked this up. It is the sharing of both parents or of one parent, the father or the mother,
Mm-hmm.
or sharing a national ancestor.
Mm-hmm.
That's the Thayer's Greek lexicon definition of that word.
Mm-hmm.
So he's not talking ambiguity like English. Oh, when you believe you're my brother. No, don't call me your brother in a church. I'm not your brother. Because that's what they try to teach you. Because I am part of what you have as well. You're not.
Mm.
Because just because a stranger is allowed in the camp because they're obedient doesn't change their title.
That is correct.
And that's something they don't want to accept. Anybody else?
No, not at the moment.
All right. All right. I'm gonna take a break on talking and let brother, you want to read for me? Yeah, I got you. First Peter 2:9-12. But ye are chosen generation, a royal priesthood, and a holy nation, dear people, that you should shew forth the praises of him who hath called you out of darkness into his marvelous light, which in time past was not the people, but are now the people of Elohim.
Come on.
Which had not obtained mercy, but now have obtained mercy. Dearly beloved, I beseech you as strangers and pilgrims, abstain from fleshly lusts, which are war against the soul, having your conversation honest among the Gentiles, that whereas they speak against you as evildoers, they may be your good works, which they shall behold, glorify Elohim in the day of visitation.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, brother. Now, before I start, I want to point out a word. It might not be in the deck that I didn't highlight it, but I want to point it out because I think it's very important. Before I talk on the red letters, let's look at that word people, where he says, which in time past were not a people.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, I just knocked my earbuds out my ears. Sorry. So that word people in Greek is the word laos, Laos. It literally means a people, tribe, nation, all those who are of the same stock and language. So he's not talking to all nations outside of Israel. So when he speaks of a Gentile in this verse, he's not talking to Israel. He's not talking to people outside of the tribes or the descendants of the tribe.
Mm-hmm.
Because the word people here should not have been translated to people. It should have been translated to which in time past were not a part of the tribe or the nation. All right? Just to point that out.
Mm-hmm.
And Peter is referencing Exodus 19:5-6. Now, therefore, if you will obey my voice indeed and keep my commandments, which we spoke on in the previous section, then ye shall be a peculiar treasure unto me above all people. For all the earth is mine, and ye shall be unto me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. He went straight to Torah. And why would you mention this to a group of people that would have known nothing? and definitely would not have wanted anything to do with Torah. If you understand the Greek colonies and the Greek mindset and the Roman mindset especially, Torah was a big issue for them because it changed what they considered their own lives, their own laws. They could not eat the very favorite animal they loved above all animals, which was the pig. The Roman diet for pork was extraordinary. It was a delicacy to them, and Torah would not allow them to eat. They could not do their holidays or birthdays associated with their gods. Torah would not allow it. They couldn't celebrate certain holidays that were specific during the years, which are the very same dates that you have established in Christianity, by the way, because Torah spoke against it. They hated it. They hated Torah, by the way. So he was not speaking to anybody in particular out of the tribes of Israel. He was speaking to the tribes. All right? Now, that being said, let's dig into these red highlights.
Mm-hmm.
Come on, Mouse. Darkness. That's the first one we're going to talk about. Darkness. Skotos, ignorance in respecting divine things. Woo! In the Hebrew, the only thing that was divine was of Yah. And what was of Yah above all else in the lives of a Hebrew? It was. That didn't change because the Messiah came. And strangers, which is parokos, one who lives in a place without the right of citizenship, meaning you weren't born in Israel or Judah. And pilgrims. Let me see if I can get this word. Perepidemos. One who comes from a foreign country into a city or land to reside there by the side of the native. Born there. If you understand the history of that time, you saw that much. And you can go to Acts, I think it's chapter 2, verse 1, and read that down, and you'll see where the Yahudim were coming from all over the place. Born, speaking a different language. They didn't necessarily speak just Hebrew. They spoke a native language because they grew up and born and raised somewhere else. So it was very common to have pilgrims to the motherland. And you see that all the time. To the Holy Land, all the time. All the time. You see that now. It's common now. In fact, I know some Hebrews here in America who travel to Israel every year as a pilgrimage. Everybody follow? All right, let's move. Let's further get into. So Gentiles is misleading here, like I told you, making you think that Peter's audience somehow didn't come from the same group somehow. But in 1 Peter 1:1, 1 Peter 1:1, you see that his audience were countries far outside of Israel. So you can understand he's speaking to people among nations who were not native to Israel because they weren't born there, and that were pilgrim to Israel. That's why it's important to understand author, audience, context, history. We have to do that because we have to understand the times. And here's Peter's statement. Peter, an apostle of Yahushua HaMashiach, to the strangers scattered throughout Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, Bithynia. These were other nations. And because we know that darkness references divine, something divine, and only God was divine, and he referenced the royal priesthood, a holy nation, something that was only written of those, quote-unquote, saints, the people who were exclusively chosen by Yah himself. We know that the term Gentiles should be nations because Peter is speaking to those who were born in other nations who come to Israel as non-citizens because they weren't born there, and pilgrims. because they traveled there in a pilgrim behavior where they would come there every year for holy days, for example, the feast days.
Mm-hmm.
They would travel back to Israel, to Jerusalem. So these were Hebrews who were chosen according to Exodus 19:5-6.
Mm-hmm.
So this was ethnos, and it was incorrectly translated to Gentiles to be inclusive, to try to say that Peter's ministry was towards that, but they were just simply among other nations
Mm-hmm.
or born outside of Israel and Yehuda. Anybody have anything with this? That want to add?
I'd like to add a supporting scripture for what you just said. You gave
Yes, ma'am.
the book and chapter already. You said Acts chapter 2, which is correct. And we can begin in verse 5. And this is what it says. And there were dwelling at Jerusalem Jews, or you can say Yahudim, right? And then it says these are devout men. And where do they come from? It says out of every nation under heaven, right? Now, this is verse 6. Now, when this was noised abroad, the multitude came together and were confounded because that every man heard them speak in his own language. So verse 5 just told you that these were people, these were Yahudim, these were Jews. They were devout men. And they could hear the people that were in the upper room speaking in their languages, which means they were born somewhere else. They were born in another nation and learned the language of that nation. So Yah was speaking to these devout men who spoke a language outside of Hebrew through the people that were being filled with the Ruach HaKodesh in the upper room. They were speaking in what they called unknown tongues or other tongues. And these people outside the room, outside in the public, these men, these devout men, these Yahudim, these Jews could hear them speaking. So when it says they were from other nations, it doesn't mean that it means that they were from different parts of the world, but they were Hebrews from different parts of the world and not outside people from other nationalities or other tribes or other ethnicities. That's not what it means. It still pointing to Hebrew Israelites. It's still pointing to the same people. You see? So it lets you know that in Acts chapter 2, verses 4 all the way down through verse 7, at least. Or you can read further. You can read further because it begins to tell you in verse 9, look where these people were from. They were Parthians. They were Medes, Elamites, right? Dwellers in Mesopotamia, Judea, Cappadocia, Pontus, Asia, Phrygia, Egypt, right? These people, these Yahudim, were from all these nations. But when you read these nations, you would think these were other people from that nation. But really, these were Hebrews that were born there, spoke the language of those areas in which they were born in, but they came to Jerusalem for the feasts. This was during the Feast of Shavuot, the Feast of Pentecost, right? When this event was taking place. Even Arabians and Cretes, if you read it incorrectly, you would think that the Arabians came to Jerusalem. You would think the Cretes came to Jerusalem. You would think the Egyptians came to Jerusalem. That's not what this is saying. This is saying there were Hebrews that were born in those nations that came to Jerusalem. And it's important to divide the word correctly. The word of the Most High, right? Okay, thank you, Brother Andrew.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Let's move to the next slide and sum it up. All right? So with ethnos, the summary of the Gentile definition for it, ethnos can mean nations or tribes, depending on the context and the author. Ethnos cannot mean, though, all other nations outside of Israel. Ethnos or Gentile is most likely used through the New Testament as a reference to Hebrews or Hebrews who were born outside of Israel and Yehuda and born separated from Yah, meaning Torahless, because that's why the ministry of Paul and Peter was focused on them, because they didn't have Torah in their lives. Ethnos can mean born outside of the homeland, but disobedient to Torah as well, such as Paul was. We have to understand how Paul's behavior was. Paul kept calling himself a Gentile.
Mm-hmm.
But what really Paul was saying is that I am of the nations just like you. I'm like you. And I'm really like you because I was born in Rome, I believe, or in a colony, one of their colonies. I can't remember exactly which one, but I believe I spoke to it in the previous section. Ethnos is the root of ethnic, and it speaks to a people of the same ethnicity, race, or nation. Gentile comes from the Latin word gentilis, of the same family or clan. And gentilis comes from gens or gentis, meaning race or clan. All of this etymology speaks to one thing, right? But we can clearly see that Gentile cannot mean non-Hebrew at all, especially in the context of the scriptures and what we've examined and its etymology. We must understand that the reason why Gentile is in the scriptures for two reasons. One, it was always translated wrong with the Western mindset. Western Christianity did this, not Europe's Christianity, by the way, if you understand the history. This word Gentile does not come from English. It comes from Latin and Greek. So that means that the change to its definition happened in the Western Christian mindset. It shouldn't even be in there. The word Gentile should not be in the scriptures. What you should see is nations, period. The word nation, period.
Mm-hmm.
All right? Mm-hmm. Everybody understand?
Yes.
Okay. Well, we're going to go to the next word that's used on the next slide for Gentile, and it is goy. Now we're going to stick to the Hebrew understanding of things. And, excuse me, and the Strong definition for goy, remember Strong has a Western bias because they use the word Gentile. And the word Gentile to the Western mindset means a foreign nation. Mm-hmm. But the Hebrew word, which is defined by Brown, Drivers, and Briggs lexicon, simply means nation or people. Mm-hmm. So the problem with Strong's, it defines goy as the modern term for Gentile. Mm-hmm. But you got to go back before the West corrupted the definition of Gentile. It didn't mean that at all because we just examined the etymology. So we know that the BDB, I like to call it, the Brown Drivers Briggs, means nations or people. Okay, so we know Strong has that bias. So we're going to try to avoid that as we go through our explanation. So let's examine how the English bias has created a problem for those who claim to be the true Hebrews. And this is a wonderful example. We have the Ashkenaz, and they are a Jewish ethnic group that has a very large presence in Israel. They're not the majority, but they are a large portion of Israel. And you can find this name in Genesis 10 verses 2 through 5, in the lineage of Noah's sons. All right? Mm-hmm. Genesis 10, 2 through 5, the sons of Japheth, Gomer, and Magog, and Madai, and Javan, and Tubal, and Meshech, and Tyrus, and the sons of Gomer, Ashkenaz, and Rithbak, and Togarmah, and the sons of Javan, Elishah, and Tarshish, and Kittim, and Dodanim. By these were the isles of the Gentiles, divided in their land, every one after his tongue, after their families, in their nation. If we go by the English understanding, the Western English understanding, Gentile is non-Hebrew, They just excluded a huge number of Jewish people from being Shemitic, which they try to claim. It's hard to claim this when the Torah says otherwise anyway. Think about that. How you going to tell me you're Shemitic when you're not even a son of Shem?
That is true.
I mean, it's right there. I'm not lying. I'm not trying to be deceptive. If the audience was questioning our claim to being Hebrew, I could throw this to you right now and demonstrate that all Shemitic claim of Hebrew comes from Noah's son Shem. One of the largest populations in the Jewish population right now in Israel are Ashkenaz descendants.
Mm-hmm.
And they're right here classified as Gentiles.
Mm.
But to be honest with you, that word should say nation. These are the nations. By these were the isles of the nations divided in their land. That's how it really should read. But since they got to keep up the front of what Gentile means, they had to translate it there, right away, so they could keep the misdirection. But it backfires because now you just excluded Ashkenaz. So, anybody want to add to that?
No, not at the moment.
The great thing about Goy is pretty simple and straightforward, and we're going to get to the ethnos was the most complicated because it's in the newer scriptures in the New Testament where Christianity really holds on to it to the way it's not used correctly, right? But Goy is something they don't really proclaim. Let's go to the next slide to really get a better understanding in the original Hebrew.
Okay.
So Goy means Gentile. Gentile had to be used in these verses due to the reference of non-Shemitic lineage. But by doing so, you include a large group of Jews who claim Shemitic ancestry to be not Shemitic, right? So let's look at Paleo Hebrew. You have the Gemel, and the Wa, all right? Means back as the middle part of the body. Now, as a noun, it means middle, the middle or in the midst of anything.
Mm-hmm.
Okay?
Mm-hmm.
And as the Gemel, Wa, and Yud, it's a nation, the people of a nation as the back or the body. So really, Goy just simply means a nation of people who are not separate or separated, who are common to others. They're in the midst of others. That's what it means. Literally like saying nation or tribe. So this contradicts the English explanation of using Gentile for this word. That proves that this knowledge should be nation or tribe if they were talking about a tribe, but this time they were talking about a nation. This proves that the English translators had a purpose.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
This was purposely done because they're going to use Goy as Gentile multiple times in the Old Testament, in the original scriptures.
Mm-hmm.
So, like I said, this is pretty simple. In summary, Goy does not mean other nations who are not Hebrew, which people call Gentile. It simply means nation in the context that it is used, or tribe. All right. Any questions with that?
None so far.
All right. So let's move now to the third major word that Gentile replaces.
Okay.
And that's Helen. So by far the most misleading of the translations is Helen to Gentile, because you'll get the point what I mean by that. We know that ethnos means nation, and it's really been used predominantly. Helen is not used a lot in the translation. But when they do translate it to Gentile, it's very misleading. After we present the meaning of Helen, you'll see the purposeful misleading of the English translators. So a Helen is a Grecian or inhabitant of Hellas, which was the early name for Greece, by the way. So by extension, a Greek-speaking person, especially a non-Hebrew. And here it is, Gentile Greek, which is, again, that Western bias definition. Okay, Western bias. Strong just does it all the time. Now let's look at theirs. A Greek by nationality. It didn't say genealogy. All right, nationality. Whether a native of the mainland or of the Greek islands or colonies. Doesn't that sound similar to America?
Yes.
Now, in a wider sense, the name embraces all nations, not Hebrews. And I'm going to point out why that's misleading. That made the language, customs, and learnings of the Greeks their own. This is the key to this definition. The primary reference of this definition, this is all in Thayer's, by the way. The primary reference is to a difference of religion and worship. So again, by nationality, but doesn't have to be a Greek, be of Greek ancestry. You just simply had to be ruled by the Greek people and become a Greek citizen, similar to what you see in the U.S. And we'll give more examples to that. Now, the reason they say all nations, not Hebrew, a Hebrew could not be a Hellen. That's why. And a Hebrew was a person who believed and practiced Torah. So what they're really saying here is that a Torah believing Hebrew would never have been Hellen because they would not have embraced the way of the Greeks. They would not have worshipped primarily the religion and the worship practices of a Grecian. They would not, because it was pagan. They wouldn't have ate the way they ate. They wouldn't have worshipped. They wouldn't have proclaimed any of the Elohims or the gods that they practiced. They wouldn't have done it. That's the reason why it says all nations, not Hebrews. Not be saying that this doesn't reference. This could not reference someone who has Hebrew blood. And we will talk more on that. But let's speak to it this point. It didn't matter, and I believe Minister White hinted towards this in one of the parts previous we just had. It does not matter, or was it Minister Ryan? It doesn't matter if you are Hebrew by genealogy or not. If you did not practice Torah, a Hebrew would not be involved with you at all. They don't give a care what you look like. You can look just like them. If you were a pagan, they avoided you, according to Torah. You just did not have a life involved with them. They weren't your friends. You didn't eat with them. You didn't commune with them because they did not practice or live by Torah. And I'll give you an example how that, you can use a modern example of how that is truly the case. If I take myself, who looks very similar to what you will find in Nigeria, for example, and I will go there, I would not know how to speak the native language. I wouldn't even know how to ask for direction. I wouldn't know their religious or cultural practices. I wouldn't even understand their food. I would be an outsider, even though I look just like them. And they will have very little experience with me because of my lack of knowing or practicing what is normal to them. That was a very common issue there. People born outside of Israel, but yet genealogy-wise, they were Israel, but they were born outside, and they did not practice Torah. So when you think of a Hellen, you know you're talking about people who speak, live, and practice everything that's Greek. And because of that, thus is not a Hebrew, not by practice, not by culture. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Anybody else want to say anything?
No, not at the moment.
All right. I may have spoken to some of this already on the next slide. Further clarity. So, and I did. I'm terrible about this, but I'll just go to the next slide without knowing. In a wider sense, the name embraces all nations who are not Hebrew that made the language, customs, and learnings of the Greeks their own, creating a difference in faith and worship. All nations who are not Hebrew references the Western definition and will be demonstrated incorrectly shortly in the coming slides. It doesn't mean that Hellenistic individuals could not be born of Hebrew blood. It does mean that most likely Hellenistic individuals were of other nations ruled by Greece and Rome, but the person does not have genetic origins from Greece. That's the key. The wider definition references the broad influence of Greek life during the Hellenistic period, which started around 323 BC. And because Rome also was Hellenistic, it lasted all the way up until sometime in the 400s AD, after his death. A very long time. And here's the helps word study that I got off of BibleHub.com to prove what all I've been saying so far. Hellene, or Helen, some people say, Greek, that's the Greek word, so originally referred to any native Greek and later became synonymous with any Greek-speaking person, anyone who followed Greek culture and especially spoke Greek. Notice it has no reference to a particular group of people of genetic origin at all. The reason why Paul is not a Hellen is because Paul practiced the law, lived by the law. So he was still considered a Hebrew. He never practiced their culture, the religion, even though he spoke the language. And you can find this reference here in this shortcut right here. All right? All right, let's move to the next slide.
Okay.
Another definition to help you understand, according to the Free Dictionary Online, Hellenes or Hellene is defined as the following: a native or inhabitant of Greece. Again, this supports the true meaning of the use. And the use, it didn't say just a native. It says anyone that inhabits Greece or its colonies as well. So let's take a look at our first scripture. Okay? Romans 2, 9 through 10. Paul's writing. Again, tribulation and anguish upon every soul of man that doeth evil. Of the Yahudim first. And the church loves to use these verses here. And also of the Gentiles. But glory, honor, and peace to every man that worketh good. The Yahudim first. And also to the Gentiles. You have to understand scripture for this. Why does Paul keep saying Yahudim first? Because the Messiah came to those who were in Israel at the time, in Yahudah, in Jerusalem, to get those to be disciples for him. So he came to them first to do a great work, which were to go to the lost, to the Gentile, to the other nations. So that's why he keeps saying to the Yahudim first, because Yahushua's ministry was in the southern kingdom, mainly in the southern kingdom. He did a lot of things in Yahudah. So in this verse, the Greek word is actually Helen, not ethnos. Why would they do that? Why would the English translators, if they were trying to be honest, would take a completely different Greek word and translate it to Gentile, with you thinking Gentile really means non-Hebrews? Because when you do that, it makes it inclusive in this verse. So if Paul was simply talking to Gentiles or other nations, not Hebrew by birth, why not use ethnos like other verses he wrote? This is because Paul was stating his audience in this chapter in verse 17. Excuse me, I got to sneeze real quick. Sorry about that.
Bless you.
So his audience was the Hebrew by birth, and the Hellen, the native Greek-speaking Hebrews born in Greek territory. Because we just went through the whole definition of Hellen. So really, here it should be saying of the Yahudim first, and also of the Greek-speaking Hebrews, or the Hellen, or the Hellenists. So this helps us understand. This adds to our understanding of Paul's audience based on what we know about ethnos and goy already. So far, every option, every use of the word Gentile in Paul's writing has been disproven. That what we've shown here has been disproven. We know that the word Gentile really should be Helen, and we know the definition of Helen because we just went over it by 3 or 4 different sources, proving that it's really speaking of those who practice and live the ways of a Greek, but not by nationality, not by nativity, not being native, but being of the nation of Greece because they were born there. All right? They weren't genetically a white Greek person, for example. They were just a citizen because they were part of one of the great colonies of Rome. And that was a big empire, huge empire. All right? Any questions with this one?
None so far.
All right. So let's look at another verse.
Okay.
All right. Acts 6:1. And in those days, when the number of disciples was multiplied, there arose murmuring of the Grecians against the Hebrews, because their widows were neglected in the daily ministry. Grecians is misleading because you would think that then they're talking about people who were non-Hebraic. But the correct word here is Hellenistes or Hellenists. So why would they use Greek-born people? Why would Greek-born people complain? Think about that. To the disciples about their widows being neglected in the ministry.
True.
Why would they do that? That alone should tell you these aren't some Greeks, some Roman citizens. The way this is worded with using Greeks or Grecians, this is done with purpose because if you use Gentile, it will not fit with the context. Because then you will be showing that Gentiles were obeying Torah because they were going to the Hebrews relating to ministry. It wouldn't necessarily fit the context. Because they know that Gentiles really wouldn't be involved with the ministry because they were of other nations. It would have made the text unbelievable. But by saying Grecians, you will still consider them Gentiles still. They were just being specific Gentiles. But here's the definition of Hellenistes or Hellenistes. A Greek-speaking Hebrew. I shouldn't even have to read no more. But, all right? Everybody got that?
Yes.
That's the Thayer's definition, by the way. And it says a Greek-speaking Hebrew or Hebrews born in Greece or Greek colonies and speaks Greek. Here's definition 2. One who imitates the manners and customs of the worship of the Greeks and uses the Greek tongue. And here's number 3. Employed in the New Testament. This is really specific. Of Hebrews born in foreign lands and speak Greek. There you go. That drops the ball. Boom. Mike gone. We can walk off the stage. I shouldn't have to talk about Helen no more. This provides the ministry of Peter right here and others where to the believing Hebrews outside of Israel and Yehuda. That's where his ministry was. All right. Any questions?
None so far.
Oh, all right. Let's read several Galatians chapter 3 before we read verse 28. All right. Who wants to read for me? Let's see. I've been hearing it's been 4 of us, so I'm gonna pick on Sister Billy.
Okay.
Okay. Do I read all of them?
Yes. Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Galatians 3:10. For as many as are of the works of Torah are under the curse. For it is written, Cursed is every one that continueth not in all things which are written in the book of Torah to do them. And Galatians 3:14. That the blessing of Abraham might come on the Gentiles through Yahushua HaMashiach, that we might receive the promise of the Spirit through faith. And Galatians 3:22, but the Scripture hath concluded all under sin, that the promise by faith of Yahushua HaMashiach might be given to them that believe. Galatians 3:28, there is neither Yahudai nor Greek, there is neither bond nor free, there is neither male nor female, for ye are all one in Mashiach Yahusha.
All right. Thank you. Thank you so much. Now let's talk through this. Galatians 3:10 talks about the curse. If these were Gentiles, why speak of Torah and the curses associated with disobedience? The first thing people try to say, well, curse just meant bad things. No, Paul only quoted Torah, only quoted the original scriptures. He was being specific to Deuteronomy 28. Because he said the works of Torah put them under the curse. And the problem we have is that the church don't define what works mean. Because Paul says in Romans, I believe chapter 3, it's 2 or 3, that he says the doers of Torah are justified or considered righteous, if you knew what the word justified meant, are just. So there's a difference between doers and works. So he's telling you here that the works of Torah make those who do these works fall under the curses. And the only people who were delivered Torah were Hebrews. And the only people that would have suffered the curses were in Deuteronomy 28, and they were specific to one people. And when you think of 14, if Gentile means non-Hebrew, why would Paul use we to include himself with them? When we know he is a Hebrew. And then with 22, if all are under sin, disobedience to Torah, that's what sin is, then how could this be said to Gentiles? Because they were never delivered. They were never delivered Torah. They wouldn't. That'd be like me going to an Inuit who lived in the Arctic and say, you are a sinner and you're going to hell because you disobeyed Torah. They would look at me like I'm crazy. They don't know what that is. And the reason these verses are particularly set before 28 is because it states the audience for you. It helps you understand the audience. We know now by reading 10, 14, and 22 that he was really speaking to Hebrews in Galatia. So now let's examine 28, the word Greek, on the next slide. All right? Unless anybody has a question.
Not so far.
All right. 1 second, please.
Mm-hmm.
All righty. So there is neither Yehudi nor Greek, there is neither bond nor free, there is neither male nor female form. Ye are all one in Mashiach Yahusha. Now, I spoke a point to somebody one time before where I said it's important to know who the real people are so you can see the prophecies moving forward in Scripture. This man who knows the word like it's the palm of his hand, he has a photographic memory for it. He quoted this verse, says it doesn't matter because it says in the Scriptures that it doesn't matter if you're Jew or Gentile or Jew or Greek. So when he said that surprised me, but he studied only the English and never had a motive or understanding that what has been delivered has not been delivered truthfully to him. Because if he did, he'll realize that the word Greek here is Helen. And we've already defined Helen in very detailed form. All right? So here it is again. Greek by nationality, whether a native of the mainland or the Greek islands or colonies, all nations not Hebrew that made the language customs, and learning of the Greeks their own. So the primary reference is to a difference of religion and worship again, remember?
Mm-hmm.
So this means that Hellenes are not Hebrews due to the way they worship, not their genealogy. We know this is true because the previous scriptures we already read demonstrated who Paul was speaking to. Galatia was located in modern-day Turkey, but was part of the Roman Greek Empire.
Mm-hmm.
If you say that there is neither Yahudi or Greek, then are there no males or females as well, looking at the same verse?
Mm-hmm.
And I know Minister White, that's a Minister White statement right there. So understanding this, we must conclude that the audience were Hellenized Hebrews living as Roman citizens in a Roman colony in the region of modern-day Turkey. And the reason he's saying there is neither Yahudi nor Greek, there's no difference in the two because they have the Messiah now. And as the scriptures we've already talked about, especially in part 5, we know that the Messiah, or no, it might have been this one, Peter points out that you end up becoming part of, you're no longer a foreigner or a pilgrim anymore to the promises. And I know Peter speaks of that and Paul speaks of that. That's why he says there's no longer a difference between us two, because he was still a Yehudi because he practiced it, even though he still considered himself of the nation.
Mm-hmm.
But the reason why they're no longer separated is because Mashiach, while once was twain, he made one. He brought the olive branches together. Anybody has anything to add to this?
Anybody? No, not so far. Mm-hmm.
All right, we're going to finish up there. All right, so we have here a summary. The next word translated is Gentile Helen. So let's read this. To help us understand the concept of Helen, we can use modern-day society as an example, and I believe I spoke to it already a little bit. If a couple who were born in Africa migrated to the United States and had a son, what nationality would he be? He would be an American. He would be of the United States.
Mm-hmm.
What would be his main cultural influence? America. Even though his parents would do their best to probably push what they can, most of his life will be influenced by America. Mm-hmm. And thus, he would be an American. Even though he looks like an African, or, in our example, a Hebrew. He would not have been considered a Hebrew due to his foreign upbringing and his religious practices. Think about that. If I go back to Nigeria, I'm not called Nigerian, even though I look just like them, and it's obvious my parents came from there. Mm-hmm. Or my father came, to be more specific. That should put this in good understanding. This was a very common occurrence during Yahushua's time, and that's one of the reasons think of the Samaritans. The Samaritans did this quite well. They blended so well with the invading peoples over many years that they blended so well culturally, religiously, and phenotypically what they look like. So Helen can mean Greek by nationality, but it does not necessarily mean by genealogy. Helen can mean native to Greece or inhabitant of Greece, but does not have to mean genealogy. Hellenists prove that the Hebrews of the New Testament were called Hellenists, referencing Hebrews from Greece or Greek-speaking colonies. Mm-hmm. All right? Mm-hmm. And I believe I have one more verse I want to share with you all before we end. Okay?
Okay.
Acts 2, 5 through 15, to add context to our understanding that Gentile reference Hebrews from other nations. And there were dwelling, minister, Mr. White spoke on this already. This is the scripture reference that we spoke of in Acts 2, 5 through 12, where you had the Yahudim, or those of Hebrew descent, coming from every nation under the sun. And the first thing they were amazed by is that these people were speaking of other tongues, but they called them Galileans, which was a city in Israel. So they're saying, aren't these Hebrews native to Israel? Shouldn't they be speaking a Semitic language native to Israel? But I'm hearing them speaking my language, and I'm a Parthian, and this one's from me, and this one's an Elamite, Mesopotamia, and even Judea. So that tells you the Galilean language was a dialect, meaning it was slightly different from what was being spoken in Judah. These are big nations. These aren't some little small cities that will have a lot in common per se when it comes to some of the local practice. They were a nation of people in 12 different nations. So you had a large body of people. And you have Cappadocia, Pontus, Asia, Phrygia, Pamphylia, Egypt. All of these Hebrews came, and I kept the word Jew just for reference, came from many of these parts hearing their own language, proving that the Hebrews were born in different countries, especially the Greek continent. Many of these areas were ruled by Rome, including Egypt. So you had to speak Greek or Latin, and Latin, by the way. So these verses provide evidence that the Yahudim lived all over the region, explaining why Peter and Paul's ministry was in many locations outside of Israel and Yehuda. But they were called Hellenes. Anybody want to add anything to this?
I'd like to make one small comment, and that is in the part that you have highlighted and read, the very last sentence where it says, "And strangers of Rome, Jews and proselytes, Cretes and Arabians." I'd like to highlight that word proselytes. That word is used there because out of all these areas that are being highlighted, it's referring to the Hebrew people. When it's no longer referring to the Hebrew people, they're called proselytes. And that word proselytes means someone who has converted, someone who has changed their opinion, their mind, their way of worship from one way to another way. So there were people there also who were not of the Hebrew ethnicity and origin and birth, but they were there worshiping too. So this is not excluding those who have chosen to take upon their the way of worshiping Yah the way He has asked us to do it. But the Bible identifies them as proselytes. They're not added to the tribes. They're not added to the 12 tribes. In the sense that they are put into the tribe of Dan or the tribe of Levi or the tribe of Reuben or so forth. They're called proselytes. They're newcomers. Yes, they're someone that the people have been talking to, the Yahudim or the Israelites have been talking to, teaching them the ways of the Most High, and then they have converted from whatever religion that they were born into over into the Hebraic faith. So the Bible has called them proselytes. I wanted to make sure that we highlight that so that the audience can see that these individuals that we're talking about from these various nations all pertain to Hebrew Israelites. And when it no longer pertains to them, they're called proselytes. That's all I wanted to go ahead.
And to make a point relative to that, the word nation out in here in the first verse is actually ethnos. So they could not say Gentile, because the context would not allow them to use out of every nation under the sun. They couldn't put out of every Gentile under the sun. Context wouldn't allow it. They had to convert ethnos, translate ethnos into the correct word, nation.
Mm-hmm.
I hope people understand how the English really, really purposely misguided people.
Mm-hmm.
All right?
Mm-hmm.
Anybody else? I'll move to the last slide for a summary.
Thank you.
All right. So, ethnos. Overall, let's talk about the meaning of Gentile. Ethnos can mean nations or tribes and cannot mean all nations outside of Israel. And ethnos in Gentile is used as a reference to Hebrews, but requires context to understand this. Goy does not mean all other nations who are not Hebrews. We've proven that. And Goy means nation in the context that it is used. Helen can mean Greek by nationality, but it does not necessarily mean by genealogy. Helen can mean a native of Greece or an inhabitant of Greece. And a Hellenist proved that Hebrews were the target of Peter's ministry. And due to Paul calling himself a Gentile, we can conclude that Gentile means the following: a Torah-believing Hebrew like Paul, but in disobedience because Paul was a Pharisee.
Mm-hmm.
And we knew how Yahushua felt about the Pharisees and Sadducees. And Hebrews born outside of Israel and Yehuda without Torah or lawless.
Mm-hmm.
So therefore, Gentile could not mean other nations. It meant nations where Hebrews who were not living right or living without the light Torah. All right, we have an understanding? Think I got Gentile well explained?
Yes.
I hope. All right, so what we're going to talk about next time, I'll just show you real quick, is who is the nation / who are the nation. I think that's important because the word nation, which is ethnos, was used a whole lot. So we need to make sure we clear that up and make sure people understand what it is. That'll be in part 7. So we thank you all for joining us. We thank you for taking the time to be in our virtual world during our wonderful Shabbat. Thank you again, and please join us for part 7.
Absolutely. Shabbat Shalom to those who are present with us today. Shabbat Shalom to those of you who are online. And Shabbat Shalom to those of you who will watch this video and join us in the very near future. Shalom.